Mhm. Okay, good. Is that not, aren't you kind of blinded? I could. So, all right. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I want to, I'm going to do a talk, the meditation at the end. And I just want to, I keep saying, because now only doing it once a month, it didn't seem to make sense to try to focus on and like going through the Yoga Sutra. That would just be a little too discontinuous, and even though there's plenty, it could, anyway, just seemed like wasn't the ideal strategy. So today I'm going to give a talk about the what is often taught is called like the Buddha's first sermon, which sounds, there are two problems with calling it that. One is that sermon makes it sound like we're talking about, I don't know, some pastor in the Bible Belt, and nothing wrong with the Bible Belt, but this is as you'll see, it's a little not really the right term exactly, but it is the first Dharma teaching. The other problem with calling it that is that depending on the perspective that you bring to your understanding of the Buddhist tradition, there are some Buddhist traditions that actually do consider this, what I'll be talking about, it's called the sutra or the sutta on the turning of the wheel of Dharma, that it really was the first teaching that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment. Those are the traditions typically, most notably in the world today, of the Theravada, which are dominant group of Buddhists in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, for example, and yet a great number of Buddhists in the world who are not from those areas geographically, more are followers of what are usually called Mahayana Buddhism. And without go on too much of a tangent, but there are traditions of Buddhism that see that the Theravada, which literally means old school, by the way, they consider themselves the old school because they're very conservative about what they accept as part of the Buddha's teaching, the record of his teachings while he was alive, the 45 years that he taught from the time of his enlightenment. Whereas the Mahayana believes that this by no means was the Buddha's first Dharma teaching. The Dharma is beginningless, and that there have been awakened beings who have been awakened or enlightened since since all reality is, in other words, the beginning of time, and beginning of time beyond what we can even conceive of, because what we're taught is not, if we're scientifically oriented, that there was a big bang and there was a singularity prior to that. Nobody can really give you any kind of coherent explanation of what that means, because of course, well, what happened before the singularity, et cetera. But in the cosmological view of both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, this idea that we're in a big bang cycle is completely coherent. It's just one of infinite number of expansion, contraction cycles. So in the Mahayana, there is no sense that they reject the idea in that the Buddha there was one enlightenment that happened one time. Even actually, to be fair, the Theravada tradition itself acknowledges that there were prior awakened ones before Shakyamuni Buddha. But they're much more, in general, conservative about their sort of perspective on what that meant for him to declare his Four Noble Truths and the awakening. So the Mahayana, just to say that the Mahayana perspective, when you start to dig more into it, has a presentation that dharma, or reality, which is another one of the meanings of the word dharma, is that suffering is completely an illusion, and we are all in a state of like limitless bliss, but we're not aware of that. We suffer because of our lack of understanding of that. When the Buddha came, this particular Buddha, Shakyamuni, he, in other words, performed the act of becoming enlightened, attaining nirvana, so that he could sort of, as a drama, so that he could give people confidence. He was going to come and talk to people who believed that suffering was real. They very much experienced it as real. And so he would teach them suffering is a real thing. It can be removed in real ways. So the Mahayana, it's not that they don't accept the Four Noble Truths. It's very essential, important part of Mahayana Buddhism. The part where it starts to fall apart a little bit is the idea that comes through in the Four Noble Truths that what we experience as confused, self-centered beings, attached in particular to something that we think we have that we don't, which is a self. We're so driven, our actions are so driven by that very central notion of the self that we suffer. And that once that can be removed, we can experience this limitless blissful state known as nirvana. And once that happens, there's no more rebirth. There's no more samsara. There's no more, it's a sort of a zero-sum game. But the Mahayana doesn't actually adhere to that, because the idea is that once you recognize that it's all actually bliss anyway, you don't need to, there's nowhere else to go. So the rebirth thing gets a little complicated. So I'm going to leave that, just bracket it and say, according to most of Buddhists, this is credited with being the Buddha's first teaching. Mahayana says that Shakyamuni's first teaching was that he gave while he was in enlightenment, in this sort of blissed out state of enlightenment, underneath the tree of enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. He gave something called the Flower Ornament Sutra that went on for 49 days, but normal humans didn't get to attend that one. This was like a super VIP event. There were only, dragons and mythical beings and angels that attended. Gives you a little sense of where the Mahayana is at. It's very, very, they have an active imagination. So the sutra, the scripture itself, known as the sutra, or in the Pali tradition, it's called sutta or sutra, which just in this case means scripture. It's a lot of repetitiveness, which is easy for memorization, which is why they call it sutra. It supposedly occurs at a time after the Prince Siddhartha, who you guys have all heard of. He lives his, most of his life, the first, I don't know, I actually don't know how old he's supposed to be when he leaves the palace. I actually don't even know that. But he lives his life of sort of unbounded pleasure. He is just having the best possible time that you can have. And he recognizes after a series of very jarring and alarming experiences that, in fact, this pleasurable experience in life that he's leading is doomed to end. His father is very concerned about this. In fact, his father, upon Shakyamuni, his name was Gautama, the Lord Gautama. When he was born, they draw up his astrology chart, which is a typical thing in India even now. And his natal chart says really strange things. All the astrologers, the Jyotishas are there and say, well, listen, this guy's either going to be a world-conquering monarch, and the king's thinking, that sounds really good, world-conquering monarch, or he's going to be this thing called a Buddha. We don't really know what that is. So his father's very concerned that he be protected from any experience of the harsh realities of life, and so he he becomes the ultimate sheltered child. And he's not allowed to leave the palace enclosure, and he lives his life happily and blissfully ignorant. He's not even encountering old people. But on a series of excursions into the city with his faithful charioteer, he has three profoundly life-altering experiences. The first is where he basically pleads with his charioteer because he's curious to see what's going on out in the world. He encounters an old person for the first time, and he's like, "What is wrong with this person? You know, they're all like stooped over and all wrinkly." Well, that's just an old person, sire. And he is deeply disturbed to hear that that's just something that happens, that just normally happens, and will even happen to him. The next trip, it says that these are the four, they're called the four sights. They're sort of the four disillusionments. The second is that he sees a sick person. Probably you have to imagine somebody with leprosy or something really visibly like they're in bad shape. And that, of course, is, you know, horrifying to him. He wasn't even aware that sickness was a thing. And then finally, he sees a corpse being brought to the funeral pyre, the area of town where they burn the cremation grounds. And at the end of this, he is so, determined that if he's going to be a proper king, he needs to care for his people. And that if he can't, these are the only things that seem to really matter to people. So he goes to his father and says, I'm going to renounce my kingdom. I'm going to go be one of these seekers, one of these strivers, they called them. And I'm going to seek enlightenment, where I can transcend these things. And his father says, you shouldn't do that. You should be a worldly person, because look at all the great stuff you could do. You could be, a great philanthropist, and you could build highways, and you could, make hospitals. He said, would I be able to cure people of old age, sickness, and death? His father, of course, admits, to his credit, he says, no, you won't be able to do that. And so he leaves. And the next 6 years of the Buddha's life story is that he practices yoga. He practices extreme forms of asceticism. Asceticism in the sense of what they usually is, I don't know of an easier word for it, but self-mortification. Basically, that the problem, if the diagnosis of our problem is that we are attached to the world, right, and to pleasure that the world can give us, therefore the body is the problem. And it's our desire in our body. See, he had lived in this world of total contentment, right? And it was very much sensually pleasing. So maybe the key to transcending or to alleviating suffering is to nullify that part of the body that would crave to seek pleasure. And so he goes in and he's with a group, sort of he has a posse, and they end up, there are two major yoga masters two Brahmin teachers that he studies with. And they teach him not only how to completely conquer his senses so that he can withstand like unbearable suffering and fasting all the time, but also that in meditative states, he's able to achieve he's able to explore astral realms, disembodied states where only gods live. But he is not in that experience of 6 years. He finds himself just getting weaker and weaker. And yes, he's very spaced out, but he can tell that the goal has not been achieved, because all that he's really doing is shutting down his senses rather than transcending suffering. And so at some point he leaves his group, this small group of ascetics who are doing these intense practices, and says, I don't think this is the right way. I'm going to go do. And they give, they're totally, he gets canceled, basically. They say he's, you've turned your back on the virtuous path. They won't talk to him. He's shunned. And he goes to a nearby place, a couple of days walk, which is now very famously called Bodh Gaya, the place of awakening in North India. And he's so weak at that point that he can no longer even feed himself. He's gone beyond. So he's seated beneath this ancient tree, and you see this in India. If any of you've been to India, these, you know, like the village tree, which these things are like absolutely massive. Usually the kinds that go out and then they come down, and I forget what that's called, the banyan tree. And he's seated there because he's really too weak to do anything. And this young woman named Sujata, who is super important in this story, she has been bringing offerings to a local like spirit fertility god because she wants to have children. And every day she brings these offerings to the tree and leaves them at the tree. And he looks so gnarly that she assumes that this is really the one. This is the spirit. And she makes an offering of this rice porridge. It's very, very, you know, nutritious, and he accepts it and he takes it. And so he's able to come back from the brink. He's actually was about to launch into an air fast where he wasn't going to breathe. So fortunately, they intercede, you know, like that doesn't happen, because otherwise he would just have croaked. He takes the porridge, his body is, you know, like energized, and you know, life comes back into him, and he suddenly understands what he needs to do, because he had had all these profound experiences in his meditations, but most of them only had to do with shutting down his mind. And he realizes that's not what he needs to do. He needs to investigate. He needs to stabilize the mind and then investigate the nature of his experience. Who is this that's having the experience? So he goes by and he sits down under the tree of awakening, and then the rest, as they say, is history, where he becomes awakened during the course of a night where he sees all of his own past births. He sees the past births and cycle of suffering and birth and suffering and samsara, you know, universally. And then he declares his enlightenment. And then I think the devil comes, the Mara is called the devil, and comes and challenges him and says, like, you're full of it. Yeah, that can't be for real. And he says, and this is the very famous gesture of touching the earth. Sometimes you see the Buddha in pictures like touching the earth, and this is called the earth touching mudra. The earth bears witness, and there are earthquakes, you know. So he then very much decides that there'd be no point in teaching anybody this, because nobody will ever believe him, and it would, you know, like he's just going to enjoy it. But the gods come and they plead with him, they petition him, and they say, you have to go and spread the Dharma, because they are really his first students. And so he wants to repay the kindness of those teachers, those who were, you know, those yoga teachers that he had. Even though they were misguided, they were very sincere, and he wants to go and repay them. But he can tell now, because he has powers of clairvoyance, that they had both passed away. But he knows that his five fellows in asceticism had retired to this nearby 2 days walk away in a place called the Deer Park. And he goes to, he seeks them out. This is a place you can visit today in India. Have you been? Did you go to Sarnath? It's called Sarnath. It's right outside of the city of Varanasi. Varanasi is a very ancient, holy city to Hindus and Buddhists alike. But Sarnath is right outside. It's a little suburb, and it's called it was a little deer sanctuary. It's a very, very gentle, beautiful place. And he seeks them out, and he sees them from a ways. He starts to approach them, and remember, he's been canceled because they think that he's a lightweight. So they're just like, okay, let's not talk to him. We're gonna ignore him. But then there's something unbelievably amazing about him. Like, they're completely floored. They say, what is it? You know, oh Gautama, you know, what has happened? I think they address him, they say, oh, friend. They said, don't call me friend. So I am the awakened. which sounds kind of creepy, admittedly, I think at first, but they're really willing to like hear whatever he has to say because it's so powerful what has happened to him. And then he proceeds to teach on the Four Noble Truths. And the first thing that he says is, it's this interesting order. If you guys are at all familiar or come across these so-called Four Noble Truths, it's sometimes talked about as like, this is the core of all Buddhist teaching, it is very, very central. It's in the order of the first truth, a so-called realistic thing that he proclaims is suffering. But it's not the first one that he tells them. First, he says, I have come to be awakened because I recognize that these two extremes must be rejected. The extremes of total sensual indulgence, basically what we live with, or we seek to make ourselves happy with external things, and the extreme of total mortification, everything that we have been doing, that you guys have been doing. Those things must be rejected. I teach the middle way. Middle way is sometimes a shorthand for Buddhism. It often refers to itself as the middle way. And he says, my middle way involves adopting, and then he uses a list of 8, it's called the Eightfold Path. And this Eightfold Path includes things like right view, right understanding, right livelihood, right speech. When they say right, the words in Pali and Sanskrit mean something more like realistic. So adopting a realistic worldview, a realistic and accurate livelihood. So it has the ethical components, it has wisdom components, and it has meditative, because there's also one that's samyak, right mindfulness is one of them as well. So basically the right techniques for training the mind, the right behaviors for supporting the training of the mind, because ethics are the foundation of all yoga practice, and the right wisdom, a correct understanding of wisdom that you come to, which he will declare as selflessness. So he first, then this is, I think is worth pointing out that when he lays that, he first gives them the fourth truth, which is the Eightfold Path. And those of you who are more familiar with Patanjali yoga, you'll see, well, that sounds like the 8 limbs of yoga. And they are almost identical in terms of, at least in the ground that they cover, the ethical, the meditative, and the wisdom side of it. What's the first thing he teaches them is he teaches them the curriculum. It's not, so this is all to say that if this, let's say, at least in spirit, this is the first ever teaching of Dharma, of Buddhist Dharma, it's not a religious teaching, it's a curriculum. It's a developmental program, right? It's a program of transformation. Adopting certain behaviors, adopting certain commitments, let's say. Abandoning harsh speech, abandoning lying. Then he goes back to the first, and he says, this is the first truth, which is true for the noble ones. So that's what makes them noble truths. Not that the truths are noble, the truths are just true. They are true for those who are noble. They are true for the Arya. The Arya is a word that means noble in Sanskrit, Aryan. So for the Arya person, for the highly evolved spiritual being, these are truths. That's what makes them noble truth, the truths for the noble. And he says the first truth is the truth of suffering. It says that all existence that is not enlightened existence is suffering. It has the nature of suffering. He'll go on to explain what he means by that more in detail. He says, so that there's the suffering of suffering, which is a no-brainer. It's like suffering of a toothache, the suffering of the loss of a child, the suffering of that we experience all the time. This is just suffering. Then there's a more abstract sort of form of suffering, which he calls the suffering of impermanence. He says that the very nature of things that we think bring us happiness are just delayed forms of suffering. When we get exactly what we want, because we were craving like whatever it is, the fine food or the great job or anything that is we crave and we get it, it is simply laying the stage, setting the stage for a future experience of loss. So there's that kind of suffering. Then he says there's a third level of even more subtle, he calls it the suffering of pervasive, basically he says the suffering because that's the way things are. Because of impermanence, because things are selfless, things don't actually exist the way we think about them. We think of them as, we think of all things as being like independent, static, like concrete, reliable entities. Even though we know, if we philosophically think about it, like a chair is only a chair because certain parts have come together, right, to make it a chair. Like you take away enough parts of the chair, it's no longer a chair. And we can handle that. That's not too abstract, It's like, well, it functions as a chair, so it's a chair. So, but we still, even though we accept that all things are causally bound up in our ecology and our biology and our everything depends upon causes and conditions. Everything, except me. For some reason, we have this huge blind spot when it comes to thinking about ourselves. We think of ourselves as being a unitary self that exists through my whole life, even though I know that I'm changing all the time. But I have this sense that there's a me inside of that. And it's that sense, it's that rigid sense of me which is separate from you, whose needs are more important than your needs, that ultimately drives me to behave in such a way as to create and accumulate negative karma. So this brings him to the second truth, which is he presents it all kind of like a medical diagnosis. So here's the disease. The disease is suffering. It has clear symptomology. It has like a more abstract version that you can talk about. Everybody can relate to it. It's a disease. This is not, this is not some made up thing by the, pharmaceutical companies. This is a disease. Everyone has it. And here's the cause of the disease. And he declares that the cause of the disease is craving, or thirst is the literal word. Thirst for, or craving for either eternal existence in this state as me, as this thing that I identify as me. I've figured out what makes me me, right? I've done that through my entire, social, by nature and nurture. And even the things that I don't like about myself, I'm willing to like resist, how hard it is to even change something that's bad for you. We don't want to let those things change because we're so identified with this self. So there's craving and attachment to things being eternal, and then there's craving and attachment to things being not matter, having no consequence, basically. So the reality is that causality is real. Cause and effect are real, which means that all happiness is the result of prior virtuous activity, karma, intentional actions, as he understands karma, and all suffering is the consequence of laying some kind of negative karmic potential for experiencing suffering. So trying to say how much more I should say about that. But basically, it's the embrace of the idea that your actions fundamentally matter. Not just involuntary actions, like terrible, like tragic things happen by no one's real fault, right? So sometimes people just make a careless error and it really wasn't, they weren't being reckless, but somebody suffers as a result. You can think of some terrible example of someone hitting someone with a car, when it really wasn't their fault. And that is indeed, that suffering is the result of karmic ripening, but it wasn't a motivated act to injure somebody. You accumulate positive and negative so-called karma, which the word just means action, because of intention. It's intentional action to either benefit others, to be compassionate towards others, or to injure them, which then brings about future suffering. He says, those causes of our happiness and well-being and suffering are real, and they are within our own hands. And they've been happening since beginningless time as we take birth after birth after birth. Right now, as a human, we have the extraordinary, rare, good fortune to be able to actually pay attention to this process of self-making. Animals don't really get to do that. They're so attached to just survival that they don't have the opportunity to sort of to step back and look at themselves becoming selves. They just don't have that. And so we are in this unique, amazing position to do what? Moving on to the third truth, where he says, if the first truth is suffering, the second is that suffering has an origin. It actually has a place where it comes from, which is our own actions. Maybe not in this lifetime, but at some point in the past, our actions, our actions have accumulated to produce conditions which now are producing these current conditions. And depending on how I respond to my current conditions will help define my then future experiences. He then further says that the removal of the cause of suffering would logically entail the removal of suffering. If you have something that has a cause and you're completely invested in causality being a real thing, and then you say, okay, fine, then you remove this cause, that effect does not happen. So the four, suffering is real. Suffering is a result of craving and attachment. The removal of craving and attachment will result in the eradication of suffering. Actually, eventually a permanent state of blissful transcendence of suffering, which he calls nirvana. And he said, then there's an actual game plan, which he calls the Eightfold Path. So in just the last 5 minutes, what we're going to do is a meditation where we're going to kind of navigate through what he calls, when he said that all things are suffering, he said that the 5 skandhas, the 5 craving skandhas, which are anyway, it's a technical term that means what we're made of. We think of ourselves as individual, unique souls or something. Actually, we're 5 life processes that are ever interdependent. Matter, sensations, ideas, feelings, emotional feelings, and then concepts and mental states. And that all of those on their own, as long as they carry this sense of I, a rigid sense of I, they will produce suffering. So what we're going to do is just find yourself with a comfortable seat. With a nice upright spine, and bring your full attention to your respiration. So you not just look, instead of pointing your attention at something, which sometimes we have this feeling of like we're aiming our attention, see if you can just completely smother the breath. Just be right on top of it. So you feel the sensation of the coolness of inhalation. And the warmth, maybe slight humidity of the exhalation. When you find that you're distracted either by sound or more likely thoughts, just simply notice the thought or the distraction, maybe label it, and return your attention to the breath. I want you to, a very short time, but short thought experiment, to artificially bring a very painful negative thought into your mind. Maybe some source of embarrassment. Classic example is being falsely accused of something. You know, that might have happened to you at some point, and you're in this terrible position of being falsely blamed for something really bad that you didn't do, you wouldn't do. So you kind of have to build that scenario, or just if you have a recent experience of it, bring it into mind. And then I want you to consider the feeling that you have associated with that. Where is it? Where do you feel it? You feel it in your chest? Maybe your head, throat? And as you look at it, see, instead of recoiling from that feeling, however uncomfortable, you just sit with it, your attention fully on it, and see it as a pattern of energy, that pressure in the chest or throat, a set of reactions around this thought. It might be so strong it's like causing your heart rate to increase. But as you watch it, you can see it is, in fact, a pattern of energy. And where do you really feel it? Where is it occurring? It's occurring in this moment, in this exact same place where you hear my voice, or where you were observing your breath. And now for one final minute, go back to observing the breath. Just start again. Fall back and just be the open space and awareness where the breath arises and falls. Okay, so that's all we have time for. And normally, if you have, when you have more time to, even just as like 8 or 10 minutes to be able to, in a variety of ways, having an experience of this strong sense of self. Like you actually can see the self arising, like it pokes its head up because it's usually the target of something unwanted, some feeling that's not wanted. And then allowing yourself to just see that, like you start to search around. So as I was saying, this comes back to these idea of life processes. Where is that sense of self? Is it in the form, physical matter? Is it in the feeling itself? Is it in the idea about the feeling? Is it in the emotion? Or is it even in the consciousness? And you sort of systematically can examine and see where you might be able to find that. And you find that you won't find it. But it's no good to just accept that you won't find it. You actually have to actively not find it. Like most things worthwhile, you have to do it for yourself. But anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.